Greetings and peace. I hope you and yours are doing well today, wherever you might be watching this from. Today, I would like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Professor Charles Wade Mills on his book, A Literary Accomplishment and a Legend of Its Own, The Racial Contract. I highly recommend all of you to read this book and support Charles W. Mills, who was born on January 3rd, 1951, and passed away peacefully on September 20th, 2021. I dedicate this to his memory and his struggles and what he was trying to teach us as a human family. And this information now, even in the 2024 world, is so relevant. I'll post a link in the description below for this book, and I hope you enjoy the summary presentation of what I learned from it. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy. And again, I represent myself only under free speech and under the copyright laws of fair use, education purposes, and nonprofit. So beginning with a little background about Professor Mills, who is a Jamaican philosopher, and his life took him from Jamaica to New York to Canada, being born in London. So he definitely had an interesting background, and he was able to see the world through his diversified experience, such as myself, who was born in Pakistan, then came to America. I've been to England as well. So we're able to see how white supremacy has affected the world. And you got to travel outside of America to really see its global impact on the black and brown people of the world. So Professor Mills was born in London, grew up in Jamaica, and later on in his life, he did become a U.S. citizen. He was educated in the University of Toronto, University of West Indies, and his parents also were basically, their education backgrounds was in England, but then they went back to Jamaica, and that's where Professor Mills was there most of his time through his studies from the West Indies, and also even teaching there, and even going to Toronto. And he also was helping. He helped unionize many of the teaching assistants, and his life has been a great example to us all. So now that we know a little bit about him teaching in New York and all these different places, now we move on to his book and what it's teaching us. And basically, the book is telling us about the political theory and how the white people of today, as much as they don't like to admit this, are influenced by white supremacist philosophies, whether they're liberal or conservative. And there is that claim that this great teacher is telling us for racial justice and international justice, and it exposes the racial presuppositions of liberal political theory. And this book is a major contribution to what we know as critical race theory today, which many people are trying to shut down in political thought. And it's just about acknowledging what we're dealing with. And we have to look at the struggle of Black Americans, especially in America, and people of a non-white background, such as myself, who come from a Pakistani background. Now, the concept of the racial contract is a way to understand and challenge this system and this political system of white supremacy. And it highlights the power dynamics and domination inherent in society and government, specifically focused on the privileges of white people. Now, the teachings of this book, it aims to bridge the gap between mainstream political philosophy and marginalized political thought. Charles Mills continues to teach us that the concept of the racial contract is a way to understand systems of racial domination. The racial contract should be seen as a political, moral, and epistemological system, and it explores the differences between the racial contract and the traditional social contract. And it emphasizes that the racial contract is real and economically exploiting non-white populations. Now, going further into this, the racial contract shows that it's a social, political, and moral framework that explains how society was created or transformed, how individuals were reconstituted, and how a moral code was established. And if you look at it further, it's a set of agreements between white individuals that categorize non-whites as inferior, causing them to have a subordinate civil standing and denying them equal socioeconomic opportunities. It shows and it established a racial state and like a jurisdictional system maintaining a reproducing racial order. This racial contract requires white citizens to consent to white supremacy, and failure to do so is seen as a dereliction of their duties. The racial contract can be seen as either representing a pre-existing moral code or creating a conventionalist set of rules, but the former version is more commonly followed. The teachings discuss the concept of the racial contract and its implications. It argues that the racial contract restricts freedom and equality to white men, creating a partitioned social hierarchy. It suggests that the racial contract requires a distorted perception of reality and perpetuates white misunderstanding and misrepresentation. The racial contract is seen as a historical reality shaped by European colonialism and white supremacy. The teachings continue to discuss the global division between Europeans and non-Europeans, with Europeans asserting power and determining the standing of non-Europeans, as we see happening today. It continues to highlight the historical use of race as a marker of superiority and inferiority, and the establishment of various contracts and doctrines that allowed for the exploitation of resources and peoples by Europeans. These include the expropriation contract, slavery contract, colonial contract, and the teachings continue to show the ethico-juridical basis of European dominance over non-Europeans throughout history. Going further, the discussion of the concept of the racial contract, which underlines the idea of white superiority and dominance in society. It shows how this contract has been historically present in various regions, including the United States, Australia, and Africa, through colonization, slavery, and discriminatory policies, even in my home country of Pakistan, still influenced by the British till this very day. The argument here is that racism is not an anomaly, but rather a fundamental part of European Enlightenment humanism. It emphasizes the need to acknowledge and understand this history of oppression to address systematic racism in history. Debates and arguments over slavery, colonization, and post-World War I discussion highlights a world governed by white people, with the system of white domination and dominance rarely challenged. The racial contract creates global European economic domination and white racial privilege. The economic dimension of the racial contract aims at economic exploitation and the privileging of white individuals. The rise of Europe to global domination is often explained by privileging internal variables and the downplaying the role of colonial conquest and African slavery. Black and brown third world theorists challenge the notion of European exceptionalism and argue that European advance is connected to the exploitation of the rest of the world. Colonialism is at the heart of Europe's rise to economic hegemony. The teachings of Charles W. Mills continue to discuss how the racial contract has created a global economy dominated by white capital, and how within Europe and white settler states, non-whites continue to be disadvantaged compared to whites. It highlights the disparities in wealth and opportunities between whites and non-whites, including myself as a Pakistani, particularly in the United States, and argues that these inequalities are a direct outcome of state policies and the collusion of white citizens. It also mentions the difficulty of quantifying the extent of racial exploitation and the taboo nature of discussing these issues in mainstream political debates. The teachings continue to highlight and discuss the norming of space and individuals in the context of the racial contract. It argues that in the racial contract, spaces and individuals outside of Europe are viewed as alien and need to be theorized about. The norming of space involves characterizing it as dominated by a certain race, while the norming of individuals involves representing them as imprinted with the characteristics of a certain kind of space. The racial contract also involves a restriction of knowledge to European colonizer and cognizers, implying that the real knowledge is not possible in certain spaces. From a moral point of view, non-European space is demonized and seen as in need of Europeanization for moral redemption. And the teachings also discuss the epistemological and moral dimensions of the norming process. And you can look at that poem, The White Man's Burden, as an example of what Professor Mills is trying to teach us here. And the teachings discuss further how space is morally characterized and divided based on race and colonization. Non-European spaces are seen as wild and cursed, while European spaces are seen as more civilized. The journey into native territory is seen as a descent into moral corruption. Further, the discussion of the moral appraisal of space based on capitalist Protestant values, Anglo-Saxon Protestant values. European settlers justified their displacement and killing of indigenous peoples based on the ideology of progress and modernization. Space is often represented as an empty and unoccupied, allowing for seizure and development, very relative to the Palestine situation today, who is also being impacted by the same madness. Indigenous populations were systematically undercounted and their extermination was seen as necessary for civilization. The racial contract links space with race and personhood, leading to the exclusion of indigenous peoples from the political community. This racialized space also marks the boundary of the state's obligations. The teachings continue to discuss the impact of the racial contract on the body and physical interactions between white and non-white individuals. The highlights of this teaching continue to show the racialized space and the regulations on the physical interactions, as well as the politics of the body in determining who is considered politic, quote unquote. The racial contract establishes a divide between a person and subpersons, creating a fundamental partition in the social ontology of the planet. White persons have historically been able to take personhood for granted, while non-white individuals face limitations and discrimination. European liberalism excludes non-whites from its promise of equality. The racial contract enshrines non-white subpersonhood and justifies different treatment based on race. The concept of subpersonhood exposes the norm of white supremacy and racial entitlement. Whiteness is defined in opposition to blackness, and white identity is tied to the rejection of the black one. The racial contract also asserts cognitive inferiority in non-white groups, denying their capacity for rationality and development. This denial leads to exclusion from the societal participation and vertical perception. Non-white cognition is only accepted when verified by white cognition. The teachings continue to discuss the concept of the racial contract and its impact on society. It explains how the racial contract transitions from biological racism to cultural racism, where non-whites are judged based on their ability to assimilate into white Western culture. The highlights of this teaching shows the influence of aesthetic norms on judgments of worth and the consequences of these norms for black individuals. It argues that the racial contracts continues to constructs race as a group identity and restricts the terms of the social contract to whites. Further, and adding on to this, it examines the writings of classic contract theorists such as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, suggesting that their work contains evidence of a racial subtext. In this book, Professor Mills discusses how different philosophers such as Hobbes, Hobbes, Locke, Locke, Rousseau, Rousseau, and Kant, Kant, I'm just spelling it out just in case I'm mispronouncing these names, incorporated racial hierarchies and distinctions into their theories of the social contract. Professor Mills argues that the racial contract, a conceptual framework that positions non-whites as subservient to whites, influenced these philosophers' views on race and society. Despite some variations in their perspectives, all of these philosophers perpetuated racial hierarchies in their theories. The teachings of this book continue to discuss Immanuel Kant's theory on race and intellectual ability, highlighting his belief in a color-coded racial hierarchy. Professor Mill argues that Kant's ideas have had significant implications and influence on race and racism. The racial contract, which underlines the social contract, restricts and modifies its prescriptions based on racial superiority and privilege. The teachings also discuss the evolution of the racial contract over time and its role in creating and maintaining white supremacy. The book concludes with the gist by emphasizing the denial of certain spaces and their contributions to European development in order to uphold the idea of European superiority. And overall, the racial contract continues to manifest itself in various forms and perpetuates racial inequalities. The racial contract is a system that perpetuates racial privilege through various means, such as job discrimination and restrictive covenants. Mainstream moral and political philosophy often ignores the impact of race and reaffirms white privilege. The racial contract evolves by changing the criteria for who is considered white or non-white. Europeans who were historically marginalized may be categorized as borderline whites. Internal distinctions within white and non-white categories can also be made. The teachings continue to discuss the concept of the racial contract, which dictates inequality based on race. The argument is there that the membership requirements for whiteness can change over time, and that the racial contract is enforced through violence and ideological conditioning. The state established by the racial contract treats whites and non-whites differently and uses physical violence and ideological manipulation to maintain white supremacy. The police, the penal system, the judge, the courts, army are seen as enforcers of the racial contract. Systematic violence and oppression against non-whites is an intrinsic part of the racial contract. Non-whites are seen as inherently savage and bestial animals, justifying the use of extreme violence against them. This violence is not only carried out by official state authorities, but also by individual whites who take it upon themselves to enforce the racial contract. In addition to physical violence, there is also an ideological component to the racial contract aimed at dehumanizing and subjugating non-whites. Non-whites are taught to see themselves as inferior and accept their prescribed roles in society, and put this fear in them. Hey, don't go to the white neighborhoods or you'll get in trouble. They'll call the cops on you. This ideology is enforced through education and the suppression of native beliefs and cultures. The racial contract prescribes non-white self-loathing and racial deference to white citizens, ultimately making it possible to characterize the contract as consensual even for non-whites. Conventional moral theory fails to address the norms and ideals that have historically prevailed in terms of race and racism. To bring about desired political ideals, it is important to recognize and understand the obstacles to their realization. By studying the actual historically dominated moral political consciousness and ideals, we can, as a human family, better prescribe for society. Racism and racially structured discrimination have been the norm throughout history, and the racial contract underwrites the social contract. A racialized moral psychology is created that allows whites to act in racist ways while thinking of themselves as acting morally. Feminist political philosophers have also noticed a similar pattern of subordination of women among classic male theorists. Understanding the cognitive distortions caused by race is crucial in correcting these injustices. The racial contract explains the partitioned moral concern where whites have agreed not to recognize blacks or other non-whites as equal. This leads to a history of European atrocity against non-whites, including genocide, slavery, and the appropriation of non-white bodies. The racial contract also leads to evasion and self-deception of the epistemic norm. The teachings continue to discuss the use of atomic bombs on civilians, genocide and war crimes, and the racial contract that values white lives over non-white lives. It mentions the Holocaust and argues that its uniqueness and how this genocide and all this stuff that's happening today, to this very day, what we are seeing with the indigenous Palestinians, how people need to recognize this. The racial contract is described as a realist perspective that explains the historic record, and it suggests that the actions of Europe in colonizing and oppressing non-European peoples contributed to the racialized ethic that led to not only the Jewish Holocaust in World War II and what we're seeing now with the indigenous Palestinian Holocaust happening today. Professor Mill argues that European imperialism has been forgotten and that revisionist history is starting to catch up with a non-white perspective. The book continues to discuss the concept of the racial contract and the role it plays in white supremacy. It mentions the opinions of Adolf Hitler and explores the idea of white renegades who reject the contract. And it highlights the different perspectives of white and non-whites in understanding the realities of race. And throughout the book, it explores the implications and consequences of the racial contract. Professor Mill discusses the importance of the racial contract and its impact on non-white individuals. It argues that the details of moral theories are less important than whether or not non-whites are included as full persons in the population. The teachings mention the struggles faced by non-whites and the focus on race in their moral and political thought. Further, it explores the concept of white unity and global white supremacy during the time of colonialism and slavery. The teachings discuss the unity among European countries in avoiding colonial wars and end of this unity in the 20th century with the outbreak of World War I. And it continues to show the common struggle against the racial contract, the notion of non-whites being engaged in a political struggle, and the person and epistemic dimensions of oppositional non-white political thought. The racial contract theory is proposed as a more accurate and inclusive framework than the traditional raceless social contract theory in understanding the political and moral realities of the world. And the argument is there that the exclusion of race and white supremacy from mainstream contraction discussions is misleading and flawed. Just like how we have people objecting teaching critical race theory. Incorporating the racial contract into political theory is necessary to challenge existing conceptions of the political system we have today. Not only political, but the system as a whole, throughout all of its forms, and to recognize the significance of race as a structuring force in society. This would require a rethinking of traditional moral and political frameworks and a more reflexive examination of how these deficiencies have shaped the perspective of white individuals. The importance of addressing race in political theory is evident in the historical struggles and movements related to abolitionism, racial vindicationism, anti-imperialism, and a cultural reclamation, which are often overlooked in mainstream texts. The teachings of this book continue to discuss the concept of the racial contract as a separate conceptual space from mainstream political theory. The argument is there that discussions of multiculturalism fail to address issues of white supremacy and the connection between race and personhood. The racial contract recognizes the reality of race while also demystifying it as a constructed concept. It emphasizes that race is socio-political rather than biological. The highlights of these teachings show that other subordinate racial contracts that exist beyond white, non-white relations. The argument is there that the racial contract does not deconstruct the social construct, but rather critiques it from a racially informed perspective. And Professor Mills aims to eliminate race as a basis for differential entitlements and privileges. The racial contract recognizes the world as it is, how it actually is supposed to be, and offers a prescription for achieving racial justice. It critiques mainstream political philosophy for abstracting away from the actual causal determinants of racial inequality. The racial contract pays tribute to black theorists who have defied oppression and offers a perspective that challenges white theory. The acknowledgement of the ongoing struggle to close the gap between the ideal of the social construct and the reality of the racial contract is shown and acknowledged. Those who ignore this reality perpetuate injustice. Professor Mills discusses the difference between their approach and Carol Pateman's view on contractarianism, the study of contracts. They argue that a racial contract is the result of European imperialism and that contract theory can be used positively once this history is acknowledged. And the discussion is there on the concept of white supremacy and how it has historically overridden class and gender solidarity. And further, race has been the identity around which whites have usually closed ranks. Professor Mills mentions in his teachings of this book the influence of empire and colonization on the perception of the other. The book continues to teach, and it contains various references to books, articles, and authors discussing topics such as imperialism, racism, the history of indigenous Native Americans, and the main themes are there on the concept of racial inequality, the impact of colonization, and the portrayal of non-European cultures in Western thought. And the teachings continue to discuss various sources and references related to the concept of race and racism. Professor Mills' teachings have references to books, articles, and historical figures such as Roy Harvey Pierce, Mary Louise Pratt, Mudimbe, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, Mudimbe, Martin Bernal, and many, many more. And it's the concept of looking at what we're dealing with today in today's world. Some scholars estimate that over 2 million Jews died from causes other than gassing or shooting in the concentration camps. But the blame for all of it, for these deaths, go to the Nazi policy. The debate on the uniqueness of the Holocaust and genocide is discussed in various sources. And the book also mentions instances on atrocities committed by Europeans throughout history, such as what they're doing now in Palestine. Many of those people there are European settlers who have no claim to that land, and they're still doing the same genocide there today. The idea of racial superiority and extermination of the indigenous peoples is condemned by various intellectuals, including Professor Mills in this literary work. And overall, the book highlights the ongoing debate surrounding genocide and the responsibility of many of the white supremacy policies we have today. So just to keep in mind what all of this is teaching us in terms of race, discrimination, marginalized individuals, societies. See, I can understand where Professor Mills is coming from. Someone who was born in Pakistan, then grew up in America, also been to England. I've seen the world just like how he has seen the world, from Jamaica to Canada to England to America, and how white supremacy has impacted and destroyed the world, the environment, equal opportunity for non-white individuals, not only in America, but all over the world where their imperialism has taken them. My home country of Pakistan till this day, it was a part of the British Raj system under colonialism. And then after that, supposedly Pakistan got their independence. But no, so many of these former colonies who are given the illusion of independence, while the British, the French, the Americans still covertly control them and their policies to benefit them and not the other. So we need to wake up and see this. I hope you were able to benefit from the summary that I gave you of this book, and I encourage you to purchase this book on your own. I'll put the link in the description below, and support the memory of our dear Professor Charles W. Mills. May he rest in peace. I do this in his honor. And again, as a disclaimer, I represent myself only as a free man under national, international laws of free speech. And this is protected under the copyright laws of fair use, education, and nonprofit purposes. Thank you. And if Professor Charles W. Mills from heaven is listening to my message, I hope I've honored you, sir, by putting the teachings of this book out there. Thank you all.